The space race was one of the most intense periods in world history. It started in 1961, when President John F. Kennedy challenged the nation to send a person to the moon. Then in 1969, the United States nailed it with Neil Armstrong's iconic moonwalk. Wait, why were we so fixated on this mission? From competing in an arms race to duking it out in the space race, to keeping the Cold War between the superpowers simmering, a lot was going on behind the scenes. This is everything you need to know about the space race, Apollo, Sputnik, and humanity's giant leap forward. The space race started as a competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. Why? Well, both countries wanted to be the best in rocket tech, especially after seeing how crucial it was during World War II. So they went headfirst into a competition to build the most powerful missiles. But then, things took a cosmic turn. Suddenly, it wasn't just about missiles. It was about exploring space itself. The problem was that nobody knew the rules of this new game. What was the goal? How would you even know who was winning? Then along came President Kennedy, who laid it out plain and simple. America's mission was to beat the Soviets to the moon. But guess what? The Soviets weren't exactly thrilled about that idea. And just like that, the space race blasted off. It kicked into high gear when the Soviet Union sent the first ever artificial satellite called Sputnik on October 4, 1957. And just like that, the space race had begun, setting off a wild spirit to the moon. The space race wasn't just about exploring space. It was also a big showdown between two powerful world superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, everything about space was controlled by a secretive military and an industrial system. They kept their launches a secret and only talked about their successes to keep everyone in the loop. But in the United States, things were totally different. They had separate agencies for civilian and military space stuff. Military projects were kept secret, but civilian ones, like the race to the moon, were out in the open. They shared both successes and failures with the world, keeping everything incredibly transparent. For a long time, the Soviets pretended they weren't racing to the moon. But now we know they were secretly competing too. Despite what they said officially, in the early days of the space race, the Soviet Union made headlines with impressive achievements. They launched the first satellite, sent the first person into space, the first woman, and even accomplished the first spacewalk. These successes weighed heavily on the United States and pushed them to catch up and surpass them. Initially, the US hoped to be the first to launch a satellite into space, but their attempt with the Vanguard rocket failed. This led to soul-searching in the country. The people wondered why the Soviets seemed to be ahead. But after these setbacks, the US Army successfully launched Explorer 1 with a modified Redstone missile on January 31, 1958. Soon after, the Navy's Vanguard also succeeded in launching a satellite. Although despite being behind initially, America had joined the space race with determination. And now they were shooting for the moon. President Kennedy wanted the United States to take the lead in space exploration. So Vice President Lyndon Johnson asked experts in NASA, industry, and the military for ideas. They believed the US could potentially beat the Soviets by sending someone around or landing on the moon, even though neither country had the right rockets yet. When Kennedy announced the goal of landing a person on the moon in 1961, Americans had only spent 15 minutes in space. But before an American moon landing could happen, there were many other milestones to achieve. The Soviets beat the US to some of these goals. However, the US had a carefully planned approach too. They started with the Mercury missions, which tested hardware and how humans could handle spaceflight. From 1961 to 1963, they did many test flights and 6 crewed Mercury missions. Then came the Gemini missions, where they used a bigger spacecraft for 2 astronauts. These missions, from 1964 to 1966, focused on improving spacecraft control, docking, and spacewalking skills. In fact, one Gemini mission even stayed in space for 2 weeks, showing that astronauts could spend enough time in space for a trip to the moon and back. Each step built on the last, getting the US closer to its goal of reaching the moon. And then, bam! The moon landing rocked the world. The Apollo program, powered by the incredible Saturn V rocket, made history on July 21, 1969. when two Americans stepped onto the lunar surface, fulfilling President Kennedy's vision. But after that lunar touchdown, the US and the Soviet Union went their separate ways in space. For Americans, it felt like winning the space race, while the Soviets focused on other cosmic goals, like setting up space stations and exploring other planets. Even though the Cold War lingered a bit longer, eventually, things thawed out. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989, and by 1991, the Soviet Union was history, officially ending the Cold War. But the space collaboration continued, with the US and Russia teaming up to build and use the International Space Station. Who would have thought space could bring formal rivals together? Even now, they have their own interests and industries in space. In both the American Department of Defense and the Russian Ministry of Defense, spacecraft for reconnaissance, surveillance, and military communications are still very important. Each country also has its own satellite systems for navigation and timing. While systems like the US GPS are commonly used by civilians, their most powerful features are kept for military purposes. Both the US and Russia are constantly trying to sabotage or weaken each other's space infrastructure. In modern warfare, having reliable space-based systems is crucial for success. This is why trying to disrupt the other side's systems could be a game changer in a battle. Not only that, but Russia and China are even experimenting with space-based weapons that can attack satellites from other countries, despite objections from the rest of the world. So, although there's been some cooperation in space, the competition to have the best space technology is still very much ongoing today. So let's dive into the Soviet lunar program and see what's up with the space race today. Back in the Cold War days, the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union had everyone on edge. Scientists, engineers, astronauts, and cosmonauts were all caught up in this high-stakes race to the stars. When the Soviets launched Sputnik on October 4, 1957, it sent shockwaves through America. While the US was still processing what this meant, the Soviets kept pushing forward in space exploration. They hit milestones left and right, like sending Yuri Gagarin into orbit, pulling off the first spacewalk, and even sending the first woman and multiple crew members into space. And guess what? They weren't just aiming for orbit. They had their sights set for the moon. Shortly after Sputnik, they started sending unmanned probes up there. The big moment came in 1959 when Luna 2 crash-landed on the lunar surface, making history as the first man-made object on the moon. Later missions even snapped pics of the far side of the moon. Then, in 1968, they took things up a notch by sending turtles on a trip around the moon aboard the Zond spacecraft. But let's not forget the big dream, sending humans to the moon. Alexei Leonov, the legendary cosmonaut who took the first spacewalk, often shared the Soviet take on the moon race. Even though people back home were confident they'd get there first, Leonov knew there were some real hurdles. Money was tight and resources were limited. Still, the Soviets weren't about to sit this one out. They set their sights on sending a crew around the moon. When word got out about the Soviets' progress, NASA had to up their game. They fast-tracked a mission called Apollo 8, adding a lunar orbit to the plan. It was a race against the clock, but boy did it pay off. The American space program scored a big win. As for the Soviets, well, they missed their shot at lunar glory. People back home weren't happy. They felt let down by their government and space experts and saw it as a blow to their country's pride. It was tough to swallow, but looking back, it all worked out in the end. The space race wasn't just about bragging rights. It pushed us to explore new frontiers and develop cool new tech. So a little competition, maybe not such a bad thing after all. Thanks for tuning in. If you want some more awesome content like this, just click on the next video.